This is should labor and the left propose a global green jobs alternative to austerity and climate change. And we have four excellent speakers. I'll point to them: Jeremy Brecher, Greg Albo, Elaine Barnard, and Robert Poland. There's a Polish. Poland. I got it right the first time. Okay.
Everybody else gets it wrong.
Yeah, I was uncertain. Just to refresh your memory in case you didn't read about it, I'm just going to read the couple paragraphs that we drew up to define this panel. We will explore the question of whether it is productive for labor and the left to propose, quote, transitional programs to address the growing global economic and ecological crisis. What types of proposals can move the agenda in the right direction? We will talk about how a global green jobs alternative might be defined and presented in a way that is convincing and attractive to ordinary people around the world. Could such a proposal end up reinforcing rather than weakening the power of elites and their institutions? If so, can this pitfall be avoided? We'll discuss what a progressive global green jobs proposal might actually look like. Can and should a jobs program be international? How can such a program be paid for? How would it realistically address the issues of climate change, pollution, development, and conservation of energy resources, migration, poverty, inequality, democracy, and the worldwide race to the bottom in wages and working conditions? Further, we will ask how, if at all, a movement for this kind of reform relates to achieving the goal of socialism. So I'll briefly describe the four panelists, and then they're going to each talk for 15 minutes. We'll then have a discussion period. You don't have to limit your remarks to a question. You don't have to ask phony questions, a long statement with a question mark at the end. So this either one is fine, but you will be limited to 2 or maximum 3 minutes so that everybody gets a chance to participate. And now and again, we'll turn to the panelists and answer their comments, accumulate a few questions, and then see what they have to say. Okay, so Jeremy Brecher is from the Labor Network for Sustainability. Greg Albo teaches political economy at the Department of Political Science at York University in Toronto and is a co-editor of the Socialist Register. Elaine Barnard is also originally Canadian, but she's not mentioned that way on the program.
Hiding it again, huh?
Who knew? Elaine is executive director of the Labor and Work-Life Program at Harvard Law School and the Harvard Trade Union Program. And Robert Poland is professor of economics and co-director of political economy at the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts. So we're really glad to have all of you here, and we will start with Jeremy Brecher.
Well, thank you very much. And I have been a follower of the Campaign for Peace and Democracy since it was the Campaign for Peace and Democracy East and West. I'm very glad at least we've improved something by, we haven't gotten rid of capitalism, but we have gotten rid of East and West. So small step. People have a great deal of difficulty, I think, on the left, thinking about alternatives that are genuinely transnational or global. And so I want to go not into detail, which I think some others will, on what alternatives might be, but to look actually at a historical example that might at least fertilize our imaginations about what a transnational strategy and program might be, and then talk just a little about what it might mean today. I also have to say that Marx has a thing about occupational deformations, people who do various kinds of jobs that get misshapen in their bodies, and we historians have an occupational deformation. We're always looking backward, and
Just be sure. Can everybody hear you?
Can you hear okay? Okay. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is a historical example, and I found that at the outset of the Great Recession, I started trying to find out something about the history of the Great Depression. And I discovered a forgotten international labor movement plan to fight the Great Depression through international public works. The origin was the German Trade Union Alliance, which included most of the trade unions in Germany. It was mainly articulated by an interesting guy named W.S. Wojtyński, who was a Russian originally. He had been president of the St. Petersburg Council of Unemployed in 1905, in the revolution, and had organized mass action of the unemployed to force the city to provide public works. Sort of like the unemployed councils here in the 1930s. And then he migrated to Germany and was working for the trade unions. And he's sort of, if anyone remembers anything about him at all, he's sort of remembered as a Keynesian before Keynes. And they developed a plan that was actually supported originally by the German unions and then by the unions around the world, which at that time mostly meant Europe, and then by the International Labor Organization of the League of Nations, which we know today as the International Labor Organization of the UN. And the basic idea was to use international credit expansion to finance international public works. In other words, sort of a Keynesian type of idea, but played out in an international framework. The core idea of how you would do it was that there would be an international agreement to lower gold reserve requirements for national currencies. And then central banks would create new money to finance international public works. That would create, in a Keynesian manner, purchasing power needed to reflate the economy. And the plan would not create runaway inflation because there was so much unutilized capacity in the productive apparatus. If any of this has a sort of familiar ring to things today, let's say, it's probably not an accident. Now, how would it actually work in practice? What was their plan? There would be an international office that would collect the newly created capital from every country, and they would establish a fund to create new purchasing power and new employment on an internationally agreed plan. Different countries would be granted loans in proportion to their need for the creation of employment. I should say, Wojtyński describes in his autobiography going every day to the unemployment lines and seeing these swelling, this is 1931, 1932, 1933, these swelling lines of people having lost their jobs, and the Nazis are down at the unemployment lines and they're looking for the big, strong guys. And when they see a big, strong guy that might be a veteran or might have a little bit of a mean look, they take him and say, "We got a job for you." And that was the context in which he was operating, was one in which there was an actual immediate idea that if you could make public works for people, you could make a counter to that situation. Now, the public works would be selected for their social usefulness, not profitability for one or another company. They would have to produce something of lasting value, but each part, as they doesn't need to show profit on capital. The point from an economic point of view was that the plan as a whole would use the resources that were being wasted by the Depression and improve conditions of life throughout the world. Individual countries would work on land improvement, roads, and housing. In other words, the same kind of things that a little later were being done in a Keynesian framework on a national basis. And European-wide, there would be work on an international network of roads, canals, electric supply, those kinds of public utility functions. His estimate was that $2 or $2.5 billion, I don't know what this would translate into now, but obviously a factor of many, many times, would imply 4 to 5 million workers and provide economic stimulus that would have a major impact in countering the Great Depression. Now, why international public works? We all know this came to be on a Keynesian basis nationally through the 30s and then obviously many historical occasions later. But we also know that there's a problem, there's a catch with trying to do it on a national level, and they were very aware of that. The core reason is the same as today as far as the problem with Keynesian policies on a national level. For example, the ILO explained it this way. In a worldwide depression like the present one, if one country goes very much ahead of other countries in its public works program, there's a danger of price inflation. And like Antinsky said, the creation of credit on a large scale represents a daring experiment for any one country. Failure would shake and weaken the economic system of the country, and more especially its finances. And obviously we can see in the drive for austerity in Europe today is being driven by this fear that any one country, if it starts having an expansionary policy, if it starts creating jobs through public works or similar kinds of Keynesian, if you will, approaches, that it will then become, its finances will become the target of international attack, and it will be, as they also pointed out in this 1933 context, trade wars and trade competition. Also, any country that followed an expansionary policy by itself would be met by trade problems. Again, very parallel to the reasons that expansionary policies are being fought today. And so the idea was that an international agreement is the only method of avoiding this danger and clearing the way for individual countries to undertake schemes of this kind. Now, the proposals that came out of the labor movement and the ILO would also have supported a broader workers program. So, for example, it would include internationalization of wage policy and social policy, something we talked about today in terms of like a social chapter for the EU, that piece of the puzzle. And it would support workers' fight for higher wages, shorter hours, social rights, and regulation of business. The kind of ILO type policies and international labor policies would be also combined with this. And it would provide an alternative to the rise of economic nationalism. So what about today? Labor and the left face a similar dilemma today. They're huge, as does society more broadly. There are huge unused human and material resources. But single countries cannot apply expansionary policies without undermining themselves in the global economy. So, but on the other hand, withdrawing from the global economy promises equal or greater catastrophe. This is the dilemma that's being faced in Greece, both by Greece as a country and by the left. You talk to people familiar with Greece, they say it's horrible, it's terrible, Greece is being destroyed by the EU and by European capital, and then you say, well, why don't they just withdraw? And then they say, you have no conception of what a catastrophe that would be. So there's the dilemma. Okay. The result is an economic war of all against all and a race to the bottom. So what would it mean to consider the approach that international labor tried to promote in 1931, using international credit expansion to finance international public works? Let me say, first of all, it's not the revolution, but it's something to think about as a strategy for what does it mean to have an international labor and left program for meeting the economic crisis. And now let me add the other piece that I think is really crucial for today, which is we face another crisis, which is the climate crisis, which is a potentially far more devastating crisis in terms of its impact on human beings, human life around the world. And somehow, I sometimes talk about left climate denialism. we don't really take on board how serious that problem is, even if we don't deny its reality. But we need to make it a central part of the way we think about what an economic alternative is. So the top need today is to reconstruct the world's economy to protect the Earth's climate in a way that also begins addressing the jobs and economic problems. And so that's most often talked about, as I'm sure most of you know, as something like a global Green New Deal. And it's had, by the way, Poland has done a lot on what a domestic Green New Deal will be, and I think we'll hear more about that in a few minutes. And this is I'm sorry?
I said more than you wanted to know.
Yeah, but I think that if you think about that as what the piece would be within this kind of larger whole, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Such a program needs to be, I don't have time to spell out what it would be, more about what it would look like, but let's just say that there's been a strong, in the international labor movement, there has been strong support for some kind of approach like that. It has not had a major effect yet in the American labor movement, but in terms of the International Trade Union Alliance, that's a very big part of their perspective. It's also the United Nations Development Program. Those are venues where this discussion is going on, has gone on. Why does it need to be international, though? Well, for the same reasons that it did in the 1930s. First, the problems are global. Obviously, global warming, obviously, global economic catastrophe, and therefore require global solutions. Second, now as then, if any country expands credit too much by itself, it is likely to face catastrophic rebound effects from the international economy. Now, after 80 years of Keynesianism, we know many ways to provide international credit expansion that didn't exist in the 1930s. And there's one example that I think is particularly relevant, which is a kind of international money known as special drawing rights. How many people know what special drawing rights are? I'm always curious. Okay, the professional economist, right? But it's a kind of international money. It's called SDRs, often called paper gold, that allows countries to create new currency reserves through the International Monetary Fund. Countries can hold SDRs in their treasuries, and then they can release other currencies that they're holding to use for buying stuff, making jobs, that kind of stuff. And it's actually very similar to what the Wojtynski plan in the 30s was in terms of freeing up national currency reserves to develop public works programs, economic expansion. It creates new money. Okay, so interestingly, at the Copenhagen conference, just before everything crashed and the international agreement broke down, George Soros arrived and proposed that special drawing rights be used to deal with the problems of need for financial support for third world countries in addressing climate change. And chairman of the Third World Caucus, the G77, Lumumba D. Aping, I'm not sure I'm saying his name right, came out with an impassioned speech. Some of you may have heard some clips from it. He was interviewed on Amy Goodman's show, in which he said, what we have to do is use special drawing rights to make available the money that's necessary for the third world to be part of the Copenhagen solutions. As we know, instead, world leaders essentially abandoned the fight against climate change, and likewise have abandoned the fight against world recession, and have been adopting the policies of global austerity. So, just to wrap up here, a quote from Wojtynski's 1931 article, Action Program for Reviving the Economy. He said the labor movement should assume the role of conveyor of the idea of an activist world economic policy and force the state and all public institutions to implement measures to revive the economy. Well, what happened instead? In 1933, 60 nations sent high-level representatives to the London Monetary and Economic Conference to forge a solution to the Great Depression. Sound familiar? The ILO voted to present its plan for large-scale immediate public works, coordinate these on an international basis. But instead of developing an international strategy to address the Depression, the conference broke down in nationalist bickering. The worldwide spread of mass unemployment, Hitler's rise to power, and World War II followed apace. So, just to address the question, should labor and the left will propose a global green jobs alternative to austerity and climate change? I'm guessing you can guess my answer.
Thank you.